Um, we were just sharing before the service, I'm kind of in love with the idea of church being an event. That when we come to church on a, well, whenever it is, but I guess for you guys on a Sunday morning, that it has the sense of being an event, a happening. We go to all kinds of events as people, you know, it could be a football match, it could be going to the cinema or the theatre, it could be a meal or going round to a friend's house. It always has a sense of being a kind of a happening, an event. Thanks, Dan. Thank you very much. Probably either knock it over or studiously ignore it now, but thank you, that's great. So there are all kinds of events in our lives and things that we look forward to and things that excite us and make us happy and feel as though we're partaking in something. And one of the kind of slight problems that we have with church is that it's familiarity. So, you know, as I come infrequently to Hope, I recognize a lot of faces that I've seen in this place many times before. I always see new faces, which is wonderful as well, people who I don't know and haven't met before. But I know that a lot of you come here this week and some of you share this burden of responsibility for, you know, for having the music and you know, the tech and all of that. And that can be a heavy burden. And I want you to kind of understand that this is really important, what you do week by week. And that in this place and in this space and in this sense of an event, that actually you meet with God and God meets with you. And therefore, as you come in here and as you go out, you should be slightly different. You should go away feeling, yeah, that was cool. That was good. That was an event. Something happened. So I hope that you do get that sense as you come. I'm also quite impressed now as somebody who doesn't have the responsibility for leading. I preach from time to time, but I don't have the responsibility for leading, and therefore I go to church as well. That's wonderful, and I'm super impressed by the people who prepare each week to deliver the worship and those who preach each week. This might not be a very good preach this morning, but I'm sure that week by week that you are blessed by that, and I would kind of want you to honour that and the work that goes into that, because I think that's really significant. Joy, thank you so much for reading that. Chris and I have been going backwards and forwards a little bit this week, saying, should we read the whole passage or shouldn't we? Now, this is an issue for you, as you are going here at Hope to go through the whole of 1 Samuel. And it's a reasonably long book. It's not hugely long, it's a reasonably long book. And there will be weeks, you know, unless you're going to be doing 1 Samuel, you know, for the next 2 years or something, you will have to kind of look at decent chunks as you go on. I hope you're able to, maybe even before you come to the service, knowing what the passage is going to be, read through it. And I thought, as I discussed with Chris, that actually this particular passage it's a lovely story. I mean, Hannah is an absolute gem, and I hope you've kind of sort of logged into some of what is going on in her life at this point. And there's a lovely little verse I want to just kind of begin with, want to kind of leave with you. Chapter 1 and verse 18, where we read, then the woman, Hannah, went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Her face, I love that. It's just lovely, that, isn't it? Her face was no longer sad. Now, when we come to a passage like this, as we said, this is one of the history books in the Old Testament. And I know as soon as you mention history, some people switch off immediately and just go, that's boring. But when we come to a book like this in the Old Testament, one of the things that I think is really important that we do is that we honestly acknowledge the kind of cultural and historical distance that is there. So, Joy, you mentioned straight away the names, the place names and the names of people, and that whole bit about Elkanah and all his forebears, his dad, his granddad, his great-granddad, his great-granddad, all of that, a great list of names, place names that mean nothing or very little to us. That kind of feels a bit strange. We need to kind of say that's okay, that feels strange. The whole idea that Elkanah has 2 wives, so polygamy, that wouldn't go down well at Hope, would it? So that kind of feels a little bit strange. That whole sense of when she takes Samuel and she goes to give thanks, she takes Samuel to Shiloh along with a 3-year-old bull that's walking behind them, and an ephah of flour and some olive oil, and then they slaughter the bull and sacrifice that. Don't think that happens very often in Lowfell these days. So we've got to admit there's a bit of strangeness there. Never mind the whole idea of giving away this much longed for son and dearly loved son and saying, right, now I've weaned him, I'm going to send him to kind of be mentored by this doddery old priest down the road in Shiloh. We have to acknowledge that that's a little bit odd, isn't it? Not the kind of thing we might want to do that sometimes with our kids, but we wouldn't go that far. So first of all, and as you go through 1 Samuel and you delve deep into the Old Testament, don't be afraid to acknowledge this feels a little bit distant to our culture, because it is. It is. Having said that, there are areas of familiarity and connection, because these were real people and we are real people, and as real people we kind of have all kinds of experiences. So there are examples of familiarity and connection. There are some difficult personal relationships in this family, Elkanah and Peninnah and Hannah. And, we all come from families, don't we? And, we get on most of the time, but there can be tensions in our families. So there's a point of contact. There's also in Hannah's life an overwhelming issue. So, she's got something to deal with. As we come here this morning, as we sit in our place, I don't know much or anything about you. I am sure that in some of your lives there will be an overwhelming issue that you are dealing with or trying to deal with, and it might be that all kinds of other things in your life are great and wonderful, but it's difficult to get past that one thing. It's kind of a bit of a black cloud. Another point of contact is that they live in troubled times. I guess as human beings we always live in troubled times. The book that chronologically comes before 1 Samuel finishes with this startling verse. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So this is a society where there are problems. There are things that are wrong. There's also the whole business of the Philistines. As you go through 1 Samuel, the Philistines are an ever-present source of threat and danger. So what I want to say as we look at this is, first of all, that this is a great human story. Yes, it might feel a little bit distant from our culture, but there are some very real human emotions being played out here, the kind of things that you and I feel and experience. And Hannah, bless her, is an absolute star. She really, really is. She's a wonderful, warm, biblical character. And her child, Samuel, after whom the book is named, will become one of the great Old Testament heroes, an absolute superstar, if you like, in the Old Testament. So there are other human beings involved. Peninnah, if she was to reflect on her behavior, might just well hang her head in shame. Whether she does or not, who knows? But she's the bully. She's the one who's inflicting some pretty hard times on Hannah. Elkanah comes out of it reasonably okay. He's kind of compassionate, but he's probably a little bit wishy-washy, It's probably his fault that they've got this problem in the first place between Hannah and Peninnah, because Hannah hasn't been able to have a child, so he's drafted in someone who does. And, year by year, Peninnah is having all these children, and year by year, it says, she's rubbing it into poor Hannah, the difficulty of her situation. Eli, also involved. Eli, like some of us, well, me, I'm not naming anybody else, is past his sell-by date a little bit. He's not as swift as he used to be. Hophni and Phinehas, his sons, as you will see as the story unfolds, spoiler alert, are the bad guys in this. They are two nasty pieces of work. They are the villains of the piece. So there's this great human story. Now, I want, in order to focus our thoughts on this, I want to focus in on what I want to call here the Hannah dilemma. The Hannah dilemma. Now, Hannah doesn't have a bad life. It would seem, if she's able to get a 3-year-old bull and drag it along to Shiloh with her, that this is a family that is not short of a bob or two. Elkanah is reasonably well off. And therefore, Hannah pretty much, from a material point of view, has everything she could possibly want. She doesn't have a bad life at all. She's loved. Elkanah dearly loves her. He gives her a double portion when they go to sacrifice at Shiloh. She wants really for nothing. But she does have this one huge problem in her life, the fact that she cannot have children. And this is a black cloud that hangs over everything else. And as I said earlier, I think that this is very familiar. Now, we can rationalize that kind of experience if we have it, and we can say to ourselves, well, you know, my life's okay. I'm not like those children in Gaza. I'm not like the people in Ukraine. I'm not this. I'm not that. But at the end of the day, if we have a kind of what appears to us to be an unsolvable problem in our lives, that weighs heavy on our shoulders. And it very often blocks out a lot of the blessings, a lot of the good things. Morris was doing absolutely the right thing there to encourage us to count our blessings. But if we're under a black cloud, that becomes more difficult and more problematic, because in our human minds, we struggle to get beyond that. And so Hannah expresses this when she speaks to Eli and says, I am a woman troubled in spirit. And there are times in our lives when all of us are troubled in spirit. And I want you to just reflect as I continue to talk about, you know, those things, that thing that might just be the thing that is a black cloud in your life. And while we reflect on that, there are 3 questions that I want us to ask about this particular passage. It's too long to go through it exactly verse by verse. You'll be pleased that I'm saying that. But 3 questions that I think we should ask. First of all, where is God in all of this? Secondly, what is God seeking to do amongst his people back then? And thirdly, what do we learn about God right now? And perhaps less importantly than what can we learn about God, what can we learn about what God is doing for us right now in our lives, in our situation? So first of all, where is God in all of this? And I think that's a good question, because as I've said, it's a human story, and God's kind of a little bit in the background here. But having said that, the presence of God is there throughout the whole of the passage. It's there in the way in which these very human actors play out their lives, and we see God at work in those situations. And as Hannah is very much the focus of this passage, we actually see the presence of God most clearly in that relationship between Hannah and the Lord, between Hannah and God. So God is an ever-present part in the life of the family of which Hannah is a part. They go to Shiloh regularly to worship. We read that in verse 7. In verse 10, she prays to the Lord through her tears, but she is expressing all that she is feeling and asking God for a blessing. Verse 11, she bargains with God. Sometimes wonder whether that's okay, but Hannah is prepared to bargain with God. I guess we've all prayed that kind of prayer before. Lord, if you do this for me, I will do that for you. You need to be careful about those kind of prayers. Be careful what you ask for, as Hannah finds out here. So she bargains with God. Give me a son, and I will give him back to you. She pours out her soul before the Lord. There is nothing held back here. It is a completely open relationship. And after she does that, in verse 18, we read that her face was no longer sad. Verse 20, she acknowledges that her prayer was answered, that God had acted in her situation. In verse 24, she actually fulfills her side of the bargain. So we see this relationship continuing through the years. And eventually, in the last part of the passage that we read, we have Hannah's song. And in this song, she gives thanks to God for all that he has done. So where is God in all of this? Absolutely present at every turn in the story, in all that is happening in these people's lives. Secondly, what is God seeking to do amongst his people back then in this strange time where people had funny names and they did funny things like taking 3-year-old bulls and slaughtering them and sacrificing them? What was God doing back then? Well, I think that there are two very clear areas in which God is at work in this passage. And the first is in the area of Hannah's own life. She's weighed down by this, what I've called Hannah's dilemma, this overwhelming burden, this cloud that she just cannot get away from. She's weighed down by that. It's kind of an existential sadness. You know, no matter how good life is, no matter how well a football team is doing, no matter how, you know, whether her horse won the Grand National yesterday or whatever, all of these other things mean nothing to her because she's got this huge problem. And actually it's made worse by the taunts of Peninnah, by her bullying activity. And so she pours out her heart to God, and as she does so, her prayers are answered. So what is God doing? God is answering Hannah's prayers, and he's answering her from the sadness and the shame that she's experiencing, and out of that comes new life and fulfilled promise. So here is God at work in the life of this particular individual, in the life of Hannah. But of course, the other area of God's activity here is in the life of the nation of Israel. And that's what you're going to discover as you go through 1 Samuel. And another spoiler alert after Hophni and Phinehas, and you might have guessed from the title of the book, Samuel's going to be pretty big in 1 Samuel, and indeed in 2 Samuel. So big he gets 2 books instead of 1, although there were probably just 1 in the first place. So Samuel is going to be big, as I said, one of the absolute heroes. And what we have in the passage that we're looking at today is an origin story. Origin stories are really good. I don't know whether we've got any film buffs here, but you know what movie makers do? They'll tell a story, and then they'll do a sequel, and then they'll do another sequel, and then they'll do another sequel, and they'll go, oh, we can't really do another one. What shall we do? I know, we'll do a prequel. We'll do the origin story of what went on. So I think it was the Star Wars, I don't know which one it was, they did one, Rogue One, a Star Wars story. And that was about what happened before the original Star Wars. I've never really watched the Godfather films. I think they're a bit violent, but I understand that Godfather 2 is the origin story to Godfather 1, or partly. So this is what movie makers do. And this is what we get in 1 Samuel. So that these opening verses are the origin story. And we really need to pay attention because Samuel is huge in what God is doing, not just in his mother's life, but for the whole of the nation. And one of our problems is sometimes that we narrow down what God is doing to ourselves and our own personal lives. And that's wonderful and amazing, but God is doing so much more. We should not limit what God is doing. And thirdly, what do we learn about God? And as I said, less importantly, what are we learning about what God can do for us right now? And in order to answer that question, I think there are 3 things that we need to point out that are important in this passage and that say something about how God is always at work. And the first thing is this, that God is showing grace to both Hannah and Israel. We need to always remind ourselves that our God is a God of grace. Secondly, in God's dealings with both Hannah and the people of Israel, God is just and righteous and always will be. And on that we can depend. So we see here the grace of God. We see the justice and the righteousness of God. And thirdly, both Hannah and Israel, because of those two things, will experience a very strong sense of hope for the future. So grace, justice and righteousness, and hope. So these are the things that we see wherever God is active. So I want to just spend a moment or two looking at grace. I don't know whether you've heard the phrase prevenient grace. That's the technical term for God's grace. Prevenient literally means going before. So the kind of grace that God offers to us is the grace that takes the initiative, that starts things off, that is already there even before we arrive, that is already there even before we get our heads around what God might be able to do in our lives. And so it appears in this story, as you kind of think about it and read through it, it might appear to you, first of all, on an initial reading, that God isn't doing anything here. And then Hannah cries out and prays. And then, and only then, God does something and answers Hannah's prayer. And Samuel is born. And as they say, the rest is history. But the reality is that God's grace is already at work in Hannah's life, prompting and encouraging. And that grace is even at work in the midst of the sadness that she is feeling, in the midst of this dark cloud that is hanging over her. And very often that grace is most clearly seen in the darkness and in the difficulty. And that's what's happening in Hannah's life. Now, we've talked about the kind of the cultural distance between 1 Samuel chapter 1 and 2024 and living in the northeast of England. Huge cultural differences. But one of the biggest differences, perhaps, is that we live in a very kind of individualistic society, a society where very much self has come to be at the center, where we think more in terms of what I want and what I need, rather than about, what God requires or what the whole of society needs. Self at the center, personal fulfillment, our right. And as a church, we would want to critique that and say that's not God's will for our lives. But if we're not careful, we can almost import that thinking into our understanding about salvation. Because sometimes if we're not careful, we can begin to think that actually God can't do anything in our lives until we repent, until we invite him in, until we decide it's time to make progress. And that's kind of putting the cart before the horse, because God's grace is always prevenient. It will always go before. It will always take the initiative. And we must not think like that. And how can we think like that if we've ever sung the hymn Amazing Grace and actually thought about the words that we're singing? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. First of all, a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. The sheer fact that we can come to a point in our lives where we can say, yeah, Lord, I really, really need you, is because we've been found in the first place by the prevenient grace of God. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, that taught my heart to fear. And you know the story, I'm sure you know the story about the guy who wrote that hymn, John Newton, who was a slave ship owner and captain, and how he came to that point in his life where he realized just his absolute need of God. Do you think that John Newton was congratulating himself on taking the initiative with God and repenting so God could be at work in his life? Of course he wasn't. He knew that his salvation was the result of God's prevenient grace. So when you're in that dark cloud and it's like, oh, I just can't get past this situation, whatever it is, whether it's a health situation, whether it's a relationship situation, whether it's just a sense of your own sinfulness, whatever it is, just know that God is already there, longing to open the way for you. So what is God doing in your life right now? He's reaching out. His grace is reaching out to you, and often reaching out in the more difficult parts of your life, because, of course, that's where you need it most. So God's prevenient grace, that's what we see in this passage. Secondly, we see God's righteous character and passion for justice. We have a God who is altogether righteous and altogether just. And in a world of compromise, we need to remind ourselves of that all the time. And what that means is that there is no place that is so dark where God does not dare to go. He is the God of righteousness and God of justice. There is no place where God does not dare to go. And that's a huge statement, a very bold statement. And how can we be so bold to say that? Well, we can be bold and say that quite simply because of the cross. Yeah, we're in the period of Easter and we're celebrating the resurrection, and that's glorious and wonderful, but there's no resurrection without a cross. And there's a wonderful old hymn. You'll not sing it at Hope. I don't think it's one that you'll sing here, but it's in the cross of Christ, I glory. And the second line is towering o'er the wrecks of time. And I love that. In the cross of Christ, I glory, towering o'er the wrecks of time, not just in the present and in the future, but in the past as well, beyond the actual time of the cross, right back to the time of 1 Samuel at the beginning of creation. The cross of Christ stands as a symbol of justice, of righteousness, of the overwhelming power of God's love. For always we preach, whether we're preaching on 1 Samuel or John 3:16 or 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we preach Christ and him crucified for each one of us for the sins of the world. For on that cross, Jesus took that symbol of oppression, the darkest of dark clouds. The cross was all about power and authority and domination and death and shame and humiliation. And he took that and he turned it into a symbol of grace and love and forgiveness and hope for each one of us. And what we see God doing in the life of Hannah and among his people, Israel, we see it in all its glorious fullness, in the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And it had to be a cross. There was no other way to demonstrate the lengths to which God would go to confront injustice and to conquer sin and death. So what is God doing in your life right now? Well, he is confronting all of that stuff about injustice, personal, systemic, society, individual lives. He's confronting all of that, and he's calling you and I to a life of justice and righteousness in his name. What does that look like? Well, we need to look a little bit at the song of Hannah in chapter 2 to discover what that actually looks like. What does God's justice look like? Hannah's song is very similar to that other song in the New Testament, Mary's song, when she goes to visit Elizabeth and she gives thanks for Jesus. You see, when God's justice begins to take effect, when God's justice comes to town, it's not good news for everyone. The Hophnis and the Phinehas's of this world are not going to welcome the advent of God's justice. But this is the way that God works. And so in Hannah's song, Hannah's prayer, we read, amongst other things, just picking out one or two things, that the bows of the mighty are broken. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread. He brings low. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Mary, in her song, the Magnificat, says he has scattered the proud. He has brought down the mighty, the rich he has sent empty away. But when God's justice and righteousness come into play, then those who are on the bottom are lifted up. And so Hannah says, the feeble bind on strength. Those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap. And Mary says he's exalted those of humble estate and filled the hungry with good things. This is the way that God works, justice and righteousness. So finally, because God's grace is always at work and always going ahead and always before us, and because God is passionate about justice and righteousness, for all of us, for Hannah, for the people of Israel, for you and I now, whoever we are, there is always hope. And there is always hope, especially in the darkest of situations and the depths of our dilemmas. Hannah discovered that in her life all those years ago. She made that journey from troubled in spirit to having a face that was no longer sad. And that's a wonderful journey to go on. And so, as in the coming weeks, you go through the books of 1 Samuel, you're going to find the nation of Israel, discovering this too, finding for themselves hope, even though they're oppressed by the Philistines. And my prayer would be for each one of us this morning that we would know this in our own lives too. Don't minimize the things that you're facing. That's a very real situation for you, but don't maximize it either. That God is already there with you in that situation, longing for his justice and his righteousness to be seen. I pray that you will know that in your own life, not to be a prisoner to despair, but to find hope in all your situations. I'm going to sing in a minute, in Christ alone, our hope is found. And there will be times, periods, stages of our lives as we go on, where we will have to live through our own version of Hannah's dilemma, when we find it so difficult to see beyond the situation that we're actually in, where we feel trapped. I remember once when I was going through a difficult period, driving, lived in Bishop Auckland at the time, and driving to Darlington, and you cross over the A1 just as you're coming into Darlington, and thinking, oh, I'd love to be on that motorway and just drive south and get away from it all. We all know that experience, don't we? Just, wanting freedom and release. We all have our own version of the dark cloud of circumstances. So remind yourself at all times that the just and righteous God is already imparting his grace into your life, even before you're aware of it. It's already there right now, and at all times be filled with hope. Let's pray together.